next is Abra, Staffin, Wiebe, post-apocalyptic horror adventure story. Check out our website at circusofbrassandbone.com.
Hi, I'll be reading from Circus of Brass and Bone. As Conrad mentioned, it's a post-apocalyptic steampunk story about a circus traveling through the collapse of civilization. This excerpt takes place several weeks after an etheric disaster pretty much destroys all technology and kills or sickens all living things around the world. So basically they're screwed. Seppin Town, Connecticut. Welcome to Seppin Town, the sign read. Customers, Christopher Knoll thought. He stopped to beat the travel dust out of his clothes and straighten his hat before he walked on. As he approached a farm on the outskirts, the little boy sitting on the farmhouse steps sprang to his feet and ran ahead. Christopher smiled. He wished he could make a more stylish entry into town, but his horse had died in the giant freak storm that struck the area a week ago. He'd been traveling by foot ever since. The one-horse towns he'd passed through recently were reluctant to lose a valuable animal, and he couldn't sell enough merchandise to afford their price. This town looked big enough that he might have better luck. As Christopher entered Main Street, the little boy trotted back out of the general goods store with a peppermint stick in his hand and a burly, balding man in a shopkeeper's apron following him. "Welcome to Seppin Town, stranger," the shopkeeper greeted Christopher. "I run the dry goods store. Just passing through, are you?" "After a fashion," Christopher said. "I'm a traveling purveyor of fine ladies' hair combs and men's shaving sets. Just the thing your customers would appreciate. I can arrange a discounted rate," he winked, "but I won't tell anyone you paid less." The storekeeper wrinkled his forehead. After a moment, he said awkwardly, "Come with me to lunch at Margaret de la Rocca's and we can discuss it. Mrs. de la Rocca runs our boarding house. Her powder milk biscuits are famous around these parts." It was a bit of an odd invitation, but Christopher wouldn't miss the first real opportunity he'd gotten since that hellstorm. When they knocked, Mrs. de la Rocca opened her door wearing an apron lightly dusted with flour. The aroma of biscuits drifted out to meet them. "Welcome," she said. "You must be new in town." She tossed a questioning glance in the storekeeper's direction. "This is Mr. Knoll," the storekeeper told her. "He's a traveling salesman selling ladies' combs. I told him how good your biscuits were." "Marvelous. Come on in. Lunch is still cooking, but I'll get you some biscuits and tea." As soon as they sat at the table, Christopher opened his salesman's suitcase. "Let me show you." Wait," the storekeeper put up his hand. "First, let's enjoy the biscuits." Mrs. de la Rocca came out of the kitchen with a plate in each hand and a biscuit on each plate. She set the biscuits in front of the men and beamed. "Go on, then." Obediently, Christopher picked up his biscuit and bit in. The biscuit was hot and fluffy on the inside, but he noticed a slight bitter aftertaste that he didn't like. Too much baking soda in the recipe, perhaps. Not wanting to alienate his host, however, he finished the biscuit, smiled, took a sip of tea, and slid sideways as the world tilted and darkened around him. He barely felt the impact when he hit the floor. 1 week later, Christopher Knoll straightened from his labor in the chicory field, pressed his hand to the small of his back, and leaned into the stretch. Dried sweat made his shirt crackle under his hand. Mud coated his pants. He was hardly the fine sight he'd been when he walked into town with a suitcase full of ladies' hair combs and men's shaving sets to sell. Something moved down the road in the distance. He squinted. Wagons, traveling their way. Poor bastards don't know what they're getting into. Can I warn them somehow? When the caravan got closer, the thought vanished. He gaped. It must be a hallucination. He'd finally cracked. The procession was led by a woman standing on top of her saddle as if that was a perfectly normal way to ride a horse. A freakishly thin and elongated man rode in one of the wagons behind her. A pair of miniature humans perched atop another, and the giant bone and brass thing that flanked them could only have ridden out of a nightmare. Impossible, Christopher breathed. Beside him, Francis straightened. Staffin in town had caught Francis on his way to a promised job in Boston, he told Christopher. A stranger in town, he'd gratefully agreed to stay the night in Mrs. Del Rocca's boarding house. He'd woken up to Chains, a strict lecture on how things were going to be during the harvest, and a nourishing breakfast of steak and buttermilk pancakes. Francis wasn't a stranger to hard labor, as his dark tan and rough hands attested, and he'd shown Christopher the ropes. It's not break time yet, Francis said now, with a quick glance at the heavily pregnant woman sitting with a shotgun across her knees. We'd best get back to work sooner, or Clara will feel like she has to do something. We have a few more minutes, Christopher said. Clara, the woman on guard duty, was not unsympathetic. She let them rest when they needed it, and when she saw to that they had enough water, she seemed almost embarrassed by the whole situation. Although I reckon she'll understand us stopping to look at that, Francis continued, staring in the same direction as Christopher. You can see it too? Christopher asked. I thought I was hallucinating. Francis laughed. I couldn't dream up those whatever they are, he pointed. Ostriches. Christopher studied them as they passed. An equestrian, a thin man, midgets, exotic animals. It's a circus. That's a whole lot of strangers. He stared after them with eyes that felt scorched dry, and he began to plan. Slowly, he worked his way, one row at a time, over until he was in a row right beside the woods. Francis drifted after him. What are you up to? I'm going to run away and join the circus. Circus of Brass and Bone. Print and ebook editions with bonus material are going to be available for purchase by Christmas. You can sign up to find out when new information is up on my website at www.circusofbrassandbone.com. And you can find other fiction by me at my website, www.aswiebe.com, or simply by searching on Amazon.com for Abra, Staffin, Wiebe. And on the merchandise table, I have cards for Circus of Brass and Bone, and also little miniature story cards. Thank you.